It was a cold night in Chicago when Dylan and Jack crossed the doors of Keller's Diner, a simple restaurant in the city center. The white lights on the facade flickered intermittently, and the sound of the coffee machine mixed with a low murmur of conversations in the background. It wasn't extravagant, but it was far from a commonplace. The two men were there, their hands trembling and breath ragged. Adrenaline coursed through their veins like an electric current, and their eyes met, sharing a silent understanding. The past week had been an emotional roller coaster. Isaac, the boy they had adopted just 2 years ago, had started asking questions. As intelligent as he was, with a curious mind for a 7-year-old, there was something in his gaze that unsettled Dylan. The gaze of someone who begins to notice what's happening around them, but doesn't fully understand. And tonight, like many others, the atmosphere of tension hung over them. As Jack pulled out a chair and sat down, Dylan paused, his eyes fixed on the menu, but he wasn't really looking at it. He was more concerned with the sound of the crumpled paper hidden inside his pocket. Money. Fake, of course, but still money. Money that had been dirty, acquired in ways he was trying to forget. But somewhere he knew he could no longer hide from it. Jack looked at him with a forced smile. "Are you okay, D.Y.?" He wasn't referring to dinner. He was referring to the fact that things were getting harder every day. Isaac, the boy, was starting to notice the changes, their nervous behavior, and Dylan felt it. He felt the lie they had built together beginning to crumble. "I don't know any more, Jack," Dylan replied, not taking his eyes off the menu. He knew the situation was slipping out of control. What had started as something simple, a small scam here and there, a fraud with no major consequences, had now become a complicated and dangerous web. They weren't just dealing with fake money or tricks to deceive small shops and innocent people anymore. They were at a point of no return. "He knows, doesn't he?" Jack asked softly, concern evident on his face. Dylan shrugged, but didn't answer immediately. It was a question he had been avoiding for days. Isaac was starting to notice. He had pulled away from them at times, not because he wanted to, but because he felt that something wasn't right. But what could they do? It was too late to turn back. They were already too deep into this. And Isaac, the boy who once looked at them with eyes full of admiration, was now starting to understand that his parents' actions weren't exactly right. It was as if a curtain was slowly lifting, revealing a scene he didn't want to believe. But what could he do? At 7, he didn't have the tools to fight against what was happening. And yet he was starting to get involved unwillingly. Of course, in the decisions his parents were making, in the lies they were creating. I don't know if we can keep doing this, Jack," Dylan's voice faltered. They had started small, buying products in stores and exchanging them for fake money. Then came the credit card fraud, the check forgeries. Everything seemed too easy, like a game. But the more they advanced, the more dangerous the game became. Now they were being watched. Dylan felt it deep in his soul, the sensation of being surveilled. And Isaac, innocent as he was beginning to absorb the weight of what was happening around him. Jack sighed and looked at the empty plate in front of him. "I don't know what to do, but one thing's for sure, Dylan. We need to stop. We can't let him get involved in this. We can't let him become part of what we're doing." But Dylan knew. He knew that there was no going back. That night, deep in his heart, he felt that the line separating small mistakes from major crimes had already been crossed. There was no turning back. And the worst part, Isaac was already starting to notice, in a silent and curious way, that things weren't as perfect as he had imagined. The little one, so full of hope, was already getting used to seeing his parents with an expression that couldn't be ignored anymore. Fear. The next day dawned cloudy, with light rain falling over Chicago. Dylan and Jack woke up early, as always, but the weight of the previous night hadn't disappeared. The boy, Isaac, was still at home, in bed, dreaming of something Dylan could no longer understand. He had always had simple dreams, loved being the hero in the stories he made up, but what worried him more now was Isaac's silence, his lack of questions. It wasn't typical behavior for a 7-year-old. "Jack, we can't keep going like this." Dylan didn't say it angrily, but with a sense of desperation. They had built a life around lies, and now the lies were starting to consume everything around them. And the worst, the boy was starting to become part of it. Jack lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. "I know. But what else can we do? We're in too deep now." Dylan let out a long sigh. They weren't just dealing with a scam here and there. Not anymore. There was something deeper. Something Isaac was beginning to see. Their behavior, the furtive glances, the whispered phone conversations, the bundles of money hidden in the garage. It could no longer be hidden. He was beginning to notice, and that scared Dylan more than anything. That's when the phone rang. Dylan looked at Jack, and the look they exchanged was enough to know it was something serious. Jack grabbed the phone and put it to his ear. "Yeah?" It was Alan's voice, an old acquaintance who had always been involved in their dirty dealings. His voice sounded tense, unusual. "Dylan, things are getting complicated. It's getting out of control. We need to talk." Dylan felt a chill down his spine. "What do you mean, out of control?" Alan hesitated before responding. "Those guys who bought the fake checks, they know who we are, Dylan, and now they want more. You know what that means, don't you?" Dylan's breath grew heavy. He stood up from the bed, walking to the window, trying to ignore the feeling of panic that was starting to take over his body. "How do they know?" Alan paused. "I don't know, but we can't keep going like this. Not while Isaac is around." Dylan closed his eyes. The mention of the boy made everything worse. He didn't know what to do anymore. Isaac was starting to see too much, ask too many questions, and worse, he was beginning to feel part of this, in a way neither of them could control. Jack entered the room with a tired look. What does he want now? Dylan hung up the phone with a deep sigh. "Alan says we're in danger. They know who we are. They're coming after us." Fear was now clear in Jack's eyes. They had played with fire for so long, and now the fire was starting to consume everything it touched. And Isaac was the most fragile piece in this dirty game. The boy, innocent as ever, was at the center of it all, unaware of how close he was to being involved. "We need to stop Dylan. He can't know about this. We can't let him see what we're doing." Dylan shook his head, his gaze lost. "I know, Jack, but I don't know what to do anymore. It's out of control." Meanwhile, Isaac played in the living room, unaware of what was happening around him. He still wore the same curious and confused expression, as if he sensed something was wrong, but couldn't understand it. And no matter how much they tried to hide it, Isaac was about to become an inseparable part of his parents' mistakes. The problem now was different. Isaac had started asking questions about money, questions Dylan wasn't prepared to answer, questions that were becoming more pointed, harder to ignore. What were they going to do when Isaac started asking about the bundles of money hidden in the garage? When he discovered that the money they were making wasn't legitimate? Jack looked at Dylan as if trying to find an answer, but the truth was no one had a solution. The weight of guilt was pressing down more and more. They had started with something small, a lie here and there, but now it was out of control. The little white lies had transformed into something bigger, something more dangerous. And worst of all, Isaac was becoming part of it without even realizing. The tension was palpable. Dylan and Jack knew they couldn't keep going like this, but they also knew they couldn't turn back. They had made choices that now couldn't be undone. And Isaac was just starting to understand that his parents, the people he loved with all his heart, were breaking the law. Dylan sat on the couch, his hands clasped in front of his face. He was lost in his own thoughts, and the weight of the situation seemed to have doubled, tripled, becoming unbearable. Every passing minute, he felt the burden of raising Isaac in a world of lies. The boy was just a child. He shouldn't be seeing this. He shouldn't be in the middle of it all. Jack looked at him with a tired look. His shoulders slumped, yet there was still a trace of concern in his eyes. He moved closer and sat next to Dylan, saying nothing, just letting the silence fill the space between them. It was Isaac who broke the silence. Suddenly he appeared in the doorway, looking at both of them with wide eyes, as if he knew something was wrong, but didn't fully understand what was going on. He stood there for a moment, waiting for someone to say something, but no one spoke. It was as if time had stopped, and the boy was the only real thing in that moment. "Dad, why are you so sad?" Isaac asked, his voice soft, filled with an innocent curiosity that cut like a knife to Dylan's heart. Dylan swallowed hard, feeling a lump in his throat. He looked at Jack, searching for an answer, but there were no words. What could he say to his son? How could he explain that the world they were creating around him was crumbling, that the choices he and Jack had made were affecting the boy's life in ways he couldn't even imagine? I'm not sad, son," Dylan finally responded, forcing a smile. "I'm just a little tired. That's all." Isaac frowned, still unconvinced. "But you don't look tired. You look worried. Like when you're looking at your phone and talking quietly with Alan." The mention of Alan made Dylan flinch inside. Those conversations had become more frequent now. Alan always had a way of making things more complicated than they should be. Dylan knew he couldn't ignore this anymore. But how could he explain to a 7-year-old that his parents were involved in something so dirty, so wrong? "Isaac," Jack began, his voice firm, trying to soften the conversation. "You're very smart, but there are things you don't need to know yet. Okay? You'll understand when you're older." Isaac looked from one to the other, clearly confused. "But I already understand. You tell me everything. I know you're doing something wrong, and I don't like it." Those words hit Dylan like a bomb to the chest. He looked at Isaac with a pain he could hardly disguise. The boy shouldn't know this. He shouldn't understand what was happening. "No, that's not it, Isaac. No. You're imagining things. I swear we're doing our best for you. The best, okay?" Dylan hurried to respond, but the words came out almost like an apology. The guilt was already taking over him. Isaac, however, seemed more determined, more mature than he ever imagined. "I know something is going on. I see you working on the computer, and you have money, lots of money, hidden. It's not right, is it?" Dylan felt paralyzed. His son's words echoed in his mind, and he knew there was no going back. Isaac was no longer in the dark. He was starting to see, starting to understand what was happening. And that was even more terrifying for Dylan than anything Alan could have said on the phone. "Isaac, I don't want you to worry about this. I don't want you to think we're doing something wrong, because we're not. It's not about money. It's just a phase, understand?" Dylan tried to explain, but each word seemed emptier than the last. The boy remained silent for a moment, and it was then that Dylan felt the weight of what he had said. Isaac was beginning to realize that their morality was on a very thin line, and he, with his innocence, was asking, questioning, and challenging everything they had tried to hide until now. Jack, who had always been the most pragmatic, now seemed completely out of place. He knew they had crossed a line, and Isaac was no longer an innocent child. He was seeing things too clearly. "Dylan, this can't continue. He's starting to question everything." Jack finally spoke, his voice filled with concern. Dylan knew he had reached a point of no return. He had started living a nightmare where his own mistakes were turning against him. And now Isaac was involved. The boy didn't deserve this, but he was in some way being dragged into the abyss that Dylan and Jack had created with their own hands. The problem was that every day it was becoming harder to turn back. The temptation to continue with the small crimes, to keep deceiving themselves with easy money, was too strong. And no matter how much they tried to protect Isaac, he was already in the lie. He was already part of it, and the worst was yet to come. Dylan knew that. The weight of guilt was only growing, and Isaac kept asking questions. The following days dragged on as if time were frozen, each minute heavy with the uncertainty of a storm about to break. Dylan tried to act normally, but the truth was he couldn't look at Isaac without feeling a pang of guilt. The boy was becoming more distant, more observant. He noticed the little things, the furtive glances between Dylan and Jack, the quick whispers, the way they hid papers, the phones always on, the secret transactions that happened at night, when he was already in bed. And the truth, without them even realizing, was that Isaac was beginning to become part of the game, unwittingly, of course. But somehow he was being dragged into the same abyss of lies, fraud, and deception. That afternoon, everything exploded. Dylan was in the living room, with the computer open in front of him. He and Jack had just pulled off a simple scam, transferring a considerable amount of money from one account to another. Something that seemed small, but was already starting to attract the attention of the wrong people. They knew they needed to stop. They knew Isaac had seen enough. But the temptation of easy money was rooted in their minds. Isaac entered the room, carrying a backpack full of notebooks and pencils, as if returning from a normal day at school. But the look on his face was not that of an innocent child. He was serious, his eyes fixed on what Dylan was doing on the computer. "Dad, what are you doing?" Isaac asked, his voice deep for his age. He seemed to understand more than his parents had realized. Dylan nearly choked on his breath. He quickly closed the computer, trying to hide what he was doing, but Isaac had already seen enough. "Isaac, You shouldn't be messing with this stuff. Dylan said, his voice cracking as he tried to stay calm. It's just business, nothing serious. But Isaac's expression didn't change. He wasn't fooled anymore. This is wrong, isn't it, Dad? Isaac asked again, his voice fearless, direct. You told me we should always be honest, but you're not. Dylan felt a chill run down his spine. The truth was there, exposed, naked before him. The boy had seen the fraud. He knew what was going on. And worse, Isaac wasn't just questioning the morality of what was happening at home. He was starting to understand, to see how deep the hole really was. Jack entered the room, heard the conversation, and stopped immediately when he saw the tense look between Dylan and Isaac. He knew the situation was spiraling out of control. It wasn't just a small financial fraud or a minor scam anymore. They were starting to lose control over their own game. Dylan, Jack began, his voice low and filled with silent concern. We need to stop. Isaac is seeing everything, and he's already starting to understand. We can't hide this from him anymore. Dylan looked at Jack, the weight of guilt crushing his shoulders. They had talked about stopping, about fixing the situation, but they always found an excuse. Money was flowing. The need for more was becoming addictive. But now Isaac knew. The boy was there, watching them, and they could no longer hide the truth. Isaac, Dylan began, trying to find words to justify the unjustifiable. But something in his son's gaze made him stop. There was no room for lies anymore. No way to deny it. The child already knew. What else are you doing, Dad? Isaac asked, his tone now harder. I saw the transfers on the phone. I saw the messages from Alan. What else are you hiding? Dylan felt a knot in his throat. Alan was the man they were doing the biggest scams with. The kind of fraud that could put everyone at risk. And Isaac already knew about it. Isaac, you don't understand. Not now, Dylan said, trying to deflect the truth. We just want what's best for you. All of this is to secure your future. Do you understand? But Isaac wasn't convinced anymore. He looked at his parents, his eyes now fully open, seeing the cracks in the perfect facade Dylan and Jack had built. You're lying. You're not securing anything. You're doing something wrong. Those words hit Dylan like a hammer. He had tried in vain to protect Isaac, but now there was no hiding anymore. It was at that moment, that exact instant, that Jack's phone rang. He looked at the screen and froze. It's Alan, Jack said, his face paling. Dylan knew what that meant. Alan was starting to pressure them. He was beginning to see the opportunity to gain more from their frauds. This phone call wouldn't be about another simple transaction. Alan was ready to take it further, to push them to a point of no return. And it was when the phone rang, and Isaac was there looking at them, that reality hit Dylan with all its force. There was no turning back. There was no more space to deceive himself or Isaac. Everything was about to fall apart, and their choices would drag the boy to the center of the storm. The weight of the truth spread through the room, and Dylan knew the moment had come. They could hide nothing anymore. And unwittingly, Isaac was already much more involved than he should be. The consequences began to unfold, and the future, which had once seemed promising, was now becoming a road full of holes and darkness. The days that followed that moment of revelation were like a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Dylan and Jack, now forced to face the truth, found themselves increasingly pressured to make decisions that would shape everyone's future, especially Isaac's. The lie they had maintained for so long was no longer an option, and guilt was becoming an unbearable weight. Isaac, for his part, seemed more distant. Dylan's words, "We're doing this for your future," echoed in the boy's head, but he no longer believed them. What had once seemed like a perfect couple, the ideal parents, was now seen in a new light, a dark and cruel light, reflecting their failure as authority figures, as guides. That morning Isaac was sitting at the kitchen table, his hands resting on the untouched breakfast. His gaze was distant, his eyes watery, and his expression was a mixture of sadness and anger. He was processing what he had discovered. What did it mean for him? How could he continue to love his parents when everything they had done was breaking the foundation of what he believed was right? Dylan approached the boy, making a visible effort to hide his own agony. He knew he was losing Isaac. He knew his relationship with his son was fragmenting before his eyes. He tried to smile, but the smile came out forced, weak. "Isaac, you know I always wanted what's best for you, right?" Dylan began, his voice low, as if he were trying to save what was left of a bridge about to fall. "We've done wrong things, and now we're trying to fix everything. I promise we'll make it right." But Isaac didn't lift his head. He knew what that meant. It wasn't a promise of change, but a promise of more lies. He felt deep down that his parents were just trying to rid themselves of guilt, and not really trying to fix the damage they had caused. Dylan's guilt seemed to eat away at everything, but the weight of Jack's choices was also beginning to be felt. He was silent, but his silence spoke more than 1,000 words. He had pulled away from everything, trying to ignore the mess his life had become. But the signs that the situation was spiraling out of control were clearer every day. Isaac, feeling the heavy air, abruptly stood up, grabbed his backpack, the same one he carried to school every day. He didn't say a word to anyone, but the weight of what he had learned made him want to distance himself from it all. He felt as if the world around him was crumbling, and he no longer wanted to be part of this story. "Isaac, wait!" Dylan ran after his son, but the boy was already at the door. "Where are you going? School hasn't started yet." But Isaac didn't stop. "I need some time." "That's all," was all he said before leaving, slamming the door behind him. Jack watched the scene from a distance, his shoulders slumping with frustration. He knew he had lost Isaac, knew it wouldn't be any easier to make the boy understand what was happening. They had crossed a line, and now they had to face the consequences. Meanwhile, in the city, the shadows of their actions were starting to close in. Alan, the business partner Dylan and Jack had involved in their schemes, was pressing harder than ever. The transactions were being monitored, and it wouldn't be long before someone else noticed the amount of money involved. The danger was becoming more and more real. That night, as silence took over the house, Dylan's phone rang. He picked up, feeling the weight of knowing who was on the other end. "Dylan," Alan's voice was laced with a threatening tone. "We need to talk. You know what I'm talking about. The money, the accounts, this all needs to be settled soon." Dylan was silent for a moment, tension flooding his body. "Alan, I need more time. I can't deal with this right now. I can't." "Isaac, he knows." Alan's cold laugh echoed through the line. "You knew what you were doing, Dylan, and now there's no turning back. Either you fix this or the consequences will come for you, and for him too. Dylan felt a sharp pain in his chest, a sense of helplessness. He knew Alan wasn't just threatening him. The words of his partner had a much deeper meaning. Isaac was in danger. With every wrong move, every mistake made, Dylan's son was being dragged into an abyss he didn't know if he could get out of. Time was running out. Dylan and Jack needed to decide what to do, but the options were scarce. Their actions had put Isaac at risk, and the only way to avoid a greater disaster was to do the right thing, to stop everything. But deep down, Dylan knew it was already too late. His son's future was at stake, and he didn't know if he could protect him from something that even he couldn't control anymore. As Isaac walked through the streets, feeling the cold wind hit his face, he didn't even care. What truly weighed on him was the mess his life had become. His small body carried the burden of the secret, the disillusionment, and the loss. He never imagined that the people he loved most were involved in something so dirty. The thought of his parents, those people he had seen as protectors, now as criminals, turned his stomach. He walked for almost an hour, aimless, Dylan's words still echoing in his mind. "I did all of this for you." But Isaac couldn't believe that anymore. How could he when everything around him was falling apart? He passed a park where a group of kids were playing. He felt strange, almost as if he were observing a parallel reality. They were innocent, carefree, and Isaac could no longer see himself in that happy childhood. Everything seemed distant, unreal. Instead of joining them, he sat on the nearest bench and watched the others have fun, while his heart beat erratically. Inside the house, Dylan and Jack were silent. The door was still closed, and Isaac's absence seemed to scream louder than any words they could say. Guilt consumed them in different ways. Dylan was trying with all his might to save what was left of his relationship with his son, but he knew nothing could erase the truth. He felt like a man walking a tightrope, where every wrong step pulled him further away from what he loved most. Jack, on the other hand, remained in his corner, the coldness of his actions starting to reflect in his own inner frustration. He knew what he had done, but he couldn't accept what it meant for him and Isaac. It wasn't just a lack of control over the situation that bothered him. It was the fact that deep down he was beginning to question, was it really for Isaac that they were doing all of this? In the room, the sound of a phone ringing broke the tense silence between the two. Dylan looked at Jack, and for a moment something in his expression revealed a kind of anguish neither of them wanted to face. They already knew who was on the other end. "Alan," Dylan said, his voice weaker than he intended. Jack, upon hearing the name, slowly stood up, as if he knew the worst was about to happen. He answered with a trembling hand, trying to sound firm, but the tension in his breathing betrayed the opposite. "Do you realize your son is out of control?" Alan's voice cut through the line, loaded with a cold venom. "I'm not here to make small talk, Dylan. Either you fix this once and for all, or, well, the consequences might be worse than you think." "Alan, I need more time," Dylan tried to argue, but the words came out with difficulty. "Isaac doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't understand." Dylan, you still think you can protect him from this? Don't you see he's already involved?" Alan laughed cynically, as if the situation were a joke. "There's no going back. What are you going to do? Try to hide the truth again? Is that what you think will save your skin and his?" Dylan was silent, feeling the pressure build. He looked at Jack, who was standing behind him, his eyes fixed but empty. It was obvious he knew what was happening, but the guilt kept him silent. They were on a road with no way back. I can handle this, Alan. Give me more time, just a little more. I need to talk to Isaac, Dylan replied, trying to sound convincing. But doubt was written all over his face. He knew that no matter how hard he tried, time was running out. Alan took a deep breath before giving his response. You have until tomorrow. If you don't fix everything by then, don't worry. I'll take care of things. My way. The line went silent for a moment, and before Dylan could respond, the phone was hung up. Those words cut like a knife. Dylan felt the pressure in his head grow. Alan had given him an ultimatum, and he knew that if he failed, Isaac would be dragged into something much worse than he already was. He stood up, not knowing what to do, thoughts racing in his mind. How could he get Isaac out of this? How could he make his son believe in him again? Meanwhile, Isaac found himself in a place where no answers seemed to satisfy him. He had walked to the nearest gas station, sitting in one of the chairs next to a diner. He was hungry, but he couldn't eat. He looked at his hands, still gripping his backpack tightly, and inside it, what he feared most, more money. More money from people he no longer recognized. It was then that he heard footsteps. Someone was approaching. He didn't need to look to know who it was. The sound of a car stopping and the silhouette of a man getting out were too familiar. Dylan stopped next to Isaac and, without saying a word, sat in the chair beside his son. The silence between them was thick. Isaac still didn't look at him, but he could feel Dylan's worried gaze on his skin. The man knew time was running out, but Isaac wasn't ready to hear apologies. He wasn't ready to face another lie. Finally, Dylan broke the silence. Isaac, listen to me. I know you're angry with me, and you're right. You're absolutely right. But I need you to help me. I need your trust. Everything we've done was to try to give you a better life, and now I need to fix everything. Isaac looked at him for the first time, his eyes filled with tears and a confused expression, as if he wanted to understand everything but couldn't. I can't trust you. Not any more, Isaac said, his voice trembling but firm. Dylan felt an overwhelming weight on his chest, and a tear ran down his face. He knew he could no longer lie. Whatever was done now, there was no turning back. The truth was before them, but it was too late to save it. The biting wind of the early morning still made Isaac shiver, but somehow he no longer felt cold. His mind was filled with confusion, pain, and anger. He looked at Dylan, who stared back with an expression full of regret, but also desperation. It was as if time had stopped right there, and no words could fix what had already been broken. Dylan could no longer hide his guilt. The words he tried to find to justify his actions seemed small, irrelevant. He knew Isaac was right. Everything he had done, all the lies and manipulation, was just an attempt to protect a future that would never be what Isaac deserved. The tension was unbearable. Jack, standing at a distance, watched the scene, too afraid to approach. He had become so detached from true emotions, from the deepest feelings, that he no longer knew how to reach his son. He didn't know how to ask for forgiveness for something so immense. I never imagined you would get involved in this, Isaac, Dylan said, trying to stay calm, but his voice faltered with each word. I did this thinking I would protect you, thinking I would ensure our family had a better life. But look what happened. Look at what's happening now." Isaac lifted his gaze to him, and what he saw was a man who resembled the father he once knew, but with eyes heavy with regret. He wished somehow he could believe his words, but he couldn't. The emotional scars he carried, the lies that had surrounded him, were too deep. "I didn't ask for this, Dad. I didn't ask you to teach me that what's wrong is right, or that it's possible to live a lie. I didn't want this kind of life. I just wanted to be happy with you guys." Isaac felt a deep pain as he said this. His voice trembled, and the words came out broken. He felt a lump in his throat that he couldn't undo. It was as if he were losing everything good in his life. I know you didn't ask for this, and if I could go back, I would do it all differently for you. I love you, Isaac, and I promise you that from now on, I will do whatever it takes to give you a better life, an honest life. We'll fix this. We'll fix everything." But Isaac no longer had certainty about anything. The 7-year-old boy who had loved his parents without question now felt that something inside him was broken, something that could never be fixed with words. He felt the weight of what had happened, and at the same time the pain of being dragged into a world of fraud and deception. The silence between them lasted for long minutes, until Jack finally approached. He was, in some way, further away than ever, and Isaac could see it in his eyes. Jack's expression was empty, as if he had already accepted the loss. "Dylan," Jack said, his voice low and cold, "what are we doing? This is no longer about Isaac. It's no longer about us. Look where we've ended up." The anger that overflowed from Jack's words was not just about what they had done, but about what they had become. "We're losing what's most important. I lost my son, you lost yours." He looked at Isaac, who for a moment felt a tightness in his chest. Jack was right. There was no turning back. They were all irreparably lost. Isaac didn't know what to say. He didn't know if he could trust Dylan or Jack anymore. But for a moment he felt a sense of relief. It wasn't the relief he had expected, but a deep relief, as if the truth was finally coming out, even if in a painful way. "I don't know what to do," Isaac said, finally breaking the silence. "I just wanted everything to be different. But I know that deep down, things will never be the same. I grew up seeing you lie, and that changed everything." Dylan looked at Isaac, and the pain in his eyes was clear. He knew that the trust that once existed between them was disintegrating before his eyes. I know, Isaac, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to fix this. Give me a chance. I'm not perfect, but I'll fight for you." But Isaac, even with his heart aching, knew that nothing could truly fix what had happened. The lie was made, and the consequences were inevitable. It was at this moment that Alan appeared, like a threatening shadow, cutting through the small moment of reconciliation. He appeared as a specter of what the family had become, with a twisted smile on his lips and a threat in every word. "I said I would fix it, didn't I?" Alan said, looking directly at Dylan. "And, well, the situation is now resolved. What matters to me now is that you pay for what you did. And as for Isaac, the game's over. No more protection." The last line was a sentence. Isaac looked at Alan, then at his parents. He finally understood what they had lost. Not just control of the situation, but control of themselves. This is no longer about you. This is no longer about any of this. "I don't need anything more from you," Isaac said, his voice calmer now. "I'm going my own way. I'm walking away. I won't be part of this anymore." With those final words, Isaac turned and walked away. Dylan and Jack stood frozen, not knowing what to do. Alan just laughed, a cold, empty laugh. In the end, Isaac walked alone, without looking back, while Dylan and Jack faced the consequences of their choices. The lie they had woven so carefully unraveled, and with it, the promises and dreams vanished. And so the story ended, not with reconciliation, but with the bitter reality that sometimes the price of our choices is far higher than we could ever imagine.